Hello. The next presentation is by Scott Gordon, and he'll be talking about retrieval of real-world data for clinical research, a Vulcan accelerator FHIR IG.
All right, thank you. I am well aware that this is the very last talk in this track for the closing session and farewell drinks. So let's just launch into this. So you may have already heard Michelle's talk about another Vulcan accelerator IG for adverse events. So this is going to be a talk about another of the foundational tracks in the Vulcan accelerator. So, okay. First, disclaimer. Especially because I am an employee of the FDA, I want to make it clear, obviously, these are my opinions only, views and opinions only. They absolutely should not be considered guidance or anything, a change in policy or anything that reflects FDA's positions. They certainly are not meant to imply any changes to guidance or regulations. There are normal outlets by which those things are announced. This is purely a discussion. So my name is Scott Gordon. I'm Senior Health Informatics Officer since 2016 at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So Michelle already gave this overview, so I'll be I'll be brief for if anybody hasn't heard this already. The bottom line is the Vulcan FHIR accelerator is focused, I'm summarizing broadly, on ways to make FHIR useful for clinical research, translational research, and regulatory submissions worldwide. And it's a large community comprised of many members through across pharma, academia, vendors, regulators, standards development organizations, and so on and so forth. And there's quite a number of tracks, which are sort of listed in code over in the middle of the screen. So this talk specifically is the RWD track of work. So what is real world data for those that are not aware of this? So I'm speaking informally. There are some formal and in some cases legal definitions of real world data. I'm speaking purely informally. This is it's information that is different than that collected for under a protocol-driven controlled clinical trial. So your typical like randomized controlled clinical trials or anything like that, where a protocol defines the actions, a protocol defines the data collection, things like that. Because a clinical trial is, for all intents and purposes, a science experiment, and it has to be to get clear answers with a high signal to noise ratio. But there's a lot of other data out there that is not as controlled, and therefore we're calling it real world data. And it's data of everyday experience. A huge amount of this that we're talking about here is things coming from the healthcare domain. So visits to a healthcare provider. So for instance, a person goes to a doctor for any reason, not as part of the clinical trial, because people do go as part of clinical trials to doctors, and information is put into an EHR. There's dispensing perhaps of a medication to that person that gets both recorded in insurance claims data as well as in the pharmacy data systems. There's a further, even beyond the core healthcare system, there are many registries, whether they are focusing on a medication or a disease or patient-oriented, where additional information is entered about that person, sometimes by themselves, sometimes by their providers. So the interest in using these as an augmentation of traditional clinical trials is it's a rich amount of data, even though it is very different and not as controlled, and can be used for things like retrospective analyses of existing EHR data, comparator arms when testing a new drug and comparing it to, say, standard of care drugs, things like that. And even in what are sometimes called non-interventional studies, where It is a sort of a protocol-driven trial, but from a physician's perspective, they're not told to do anything differently. They make their own decisions, as opposed to interventional studies where there's clear triggers to take certain actions. So what is this track trying to address? There's a huge difference in the entire business, if you will, business processes behind how clinical trials are run and regulatory review is done and how the healthcare system works. So that's reflected in how data looks and how the expectations of the data actually are. So there are an enormous amounts of gaps that need to be bridged to make healthcare data usable in a research and a regulatory context. Short list here, but they're the biggies, differences in semantics, the actual meaning of the precise meaning of every bit of information, the syntax, of course, the terminology systems, the coding systems, things that are being used, the different business practices and levels of granularity and completeness, and again, not exhaustive list. There is no one effort that is going to solve all of that. So, but there are many groups working on many aspects of this. So hopefully as a totality, this will happen. But where this track, the Vulcan real-world data track sort of fits in the spectrum is this. So very simplistic view of a pathway of real-world data based research. So you have various sources here on the left of EHRs and maybe other real-world other data sources, claims, registries, things like that. Here's an example of just a single data pull from a single EHR. In reality, there'd probably be pulls from various information sources and various steps in the data making its way to a researcher. That's all hugely summarized in this middle bit, where many things happen, steps in curation, linkage of different data sets, and then the actual research and analysis based on the sort of curated data sets. Ultimately, if there's a study that, a research study that sponsor wants to submit to a regulatory agency, they'll package it in a way that any particular regulatory agency asks for it, and ultimately submits it as part of their package to the pharmaceutical regulators across the globe. In the US FDA, there's the European Medical Agency, and in Japan, there's the PMDA, and many others around the globe. So the scope that this track is taking, it covers, is very, very tightly focused, really right at the beginning. It's focused very much on the EHR end of the system and very much on EHRs for now in particular. And the big focus that we've taken so far is to propose the sort of syntax, like the structure and what required information, the structure of information and what information it should be required. And in the long run, in combination with other efforts, the hope is that this work will fit in with all the other work that's going on, so that we have a continuum where, from our side, if we have a FHIR IG that promotes a consistent and standardized use of the FHIR data standard at the source, this will promote easier and more consistent retrieval of data, regardless of the EHR in question. So retrieval of data and potentially aggregation, or sort of having larger data sets created from individual EHR polls, that will be more consistent and therefore easier to perform subsequent research on, and allowing ultimately a more consistent packaging of all of this study information for ultimate submission to FDA or to any of the global regulators. At this point, there's a junction here where we're hoping there's an evolution of a significant amount of standardization in the use of FHIR among other data standards, that there'll be a natural tendency to have regulators and other groups sort of leverage that in determining what standards say a global regulator like FDA would actually ask sponsors to use when submitting the data. And I highlight US CDI and US core from a US perspective, and there are international versions of this, of a sort of a nexus where a lot of this can happen, where the learnings even from this track are fed into proposals for additional elements to include into future versions of US core, which could then be potentially adopted by regulators such as FDA. So our approach to creating this implementation guide, we ended up settling on trying to be very focused, because there's a million possible things that could be needed, but we decided to actually pick some basic clinical research questions, ones that were amenable to a real-world data approach, and have a series of questions. Start with the first question, go down a process, and iteratively work through a number of different research questions, theoretically, until we kind of have all the information we need. So the cycle would include basically what data would we need to answer the particular question for this research use case, evaluate if and how FHIR supports each of those data needs, and in the IG establish what we consider reasonable requirements for FHIR profiles, that reasonable in the sense that nothing that exists in this implementation guide is radically new. It's core healthcare concepts. It's just they may not be, in fact, they are not all currently required, even in some of the strictest required cores, such as US core. But that was intentional. We want to push above and beyond what is currently the minimum requirements. And we have a justification for that from a research perspective. And then, as I said, we would sort of repeat. We repeated this a few times, and at this point, we sort of taken a pause to take next steps before continuing the process. So the current implementation guide, it was just published. It went through connectathons and balloting, and it was just published, and the link is there. It is based on the international patient access profiles, which are, as many of you may know, sort of the nexus, are intended to be the nexus, which will support and will be supportive of the use of various cores, US core, Canada baseline, Australia core, etc. So hoping that this should make this pretty usable across international use cases. And the bottom line is the two central functions that this IG supports is first, a step that we took of cohort building. In other words, first, we typically in a clinical trial, you find patients that match a certain set of criteria that you would like in the study and the criteria that you think are not good for a study. They're typically called inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then a separate but connected, you can use either of these independently, use of kind of the real nexus of this implementation guide of actually finding the data. So you're coming in with a cohort of patients pulled from an EHR or multiple EHRs, and then having the support to retrieve all the required information that will support research needs for the particular research question in play. I'm showing here are the resources that are currently profiled in this implementation guide. As you can see, there are things that in the future could be added. This covers the basics, medications and laboratory observations, procedures, and so on. You might notice you don't see devices and other things that would be relevant as well. So, but this is where this version 1 IG is currently at. The IG highlights areas that we would think would be good for further standardization of the use of the FHIR standard. So all these profiles, like I said before, are built off of common medical concepts. There's bread and butter healthcare information, so nothing new there, but they do push a little more in terms of the bits that are required than even US Core does. And from our perspective, they do seem reasonable. though, within the context of healthcare practice. So as a summary, this sort of presents where we go above and beyond US core. This is comparing the IG to the current 6.1.0 version of US core. And here you can see where there's a number of additional elements that are either must support or required, or in two cases, medication administration and statement, where the use of the resource itself is already sort of above and beyond what US core asks for. So we've called this aspirational, and we'd like this also to be sort of the start of a discussion where it's actually something actionable. So a simple summary of like a couple of the challenges we think this IG has addressed. Very simple presentation of this. One of them is that, you know, information in a healthcare space and a research and regulatory space are similar, but often not exactly the same, and they need semantic clarity. So in the healthcare domain, a simple example: when did the patient take a medication, or a person take a medication? Sounds straightforward. In the healthcare space, of course, these are what we've been calling encounter-based records. It could be a prescription of a medication. The record could be a prescription. It could be a dispense by a pharmacy. It could be an administration in inpatient settings, or an assertion, a statement, or whatever by a patient, a doctor, a caregiver. I take this drug and I've taken it over these months and years. In the clinical research world, is very much very defined in what a date of a medication being taken means, and there's much more sense of a surety of that medication being taken. So the result of this, though, is if you simply pull the date from a prescription record, as an example, one might ask, so is this when the person took the drug? And the answer would be, I don't know, because you don't even know if it's a prescription or not. So this IG promotes semantic clarity by promoting the pulling of additional information that isn't typically expected in clinical trials data, such as this is a prescription. And now you, as a researcher and as a regulatory reviewer, will know that's what this date means. It's a prescription, not an administration. Proceed accordingly. Same thing. Same thing here. Some concepts are not yet standardized at the source. So for administration records, which are quite valuable because they're kind of proof of actual ingestion, the reality is there isn't as much standardization of medication administration, as there are for certain other medication encounters. So it's not as easy to pull, or it's not as consistent. This IG asks for medication administration to actually be standardized in a FHIR compliant way. So our future work at this point is we're currently looking to find sites interested in pilot testing. We are reviewing options for future improvement of the implementation guide, including support for more information, as well as terminology challenges, which I did not touch in this talk, and working to coordinate with other aligned FHIR efforts that are sort of in that whole spectrum of real-world data research. So in summary, the use of healthcare data as real-world data to support clinical research has numerous challenges. The Vulcan Accelerator track is focused on specifically challenges at the source, and specifically EHR at this time, and in retrieving enough information to keep the full truth of the original healthcare record intact. This IG is a first step, having presented the benefits of improved consistency in the FHIR representation of core healthcare concepts. And it pushes the boundaries of what we would think is a minimally sufficient use of FHIR, while being completely within the normal realm of healthcare concepts. And the track is definitely interested in potential pilot partners. So I'll finish with my contact information and the links to the Real World Data Project page, as well as, again, a repeat of the link to the implementation guide itself. So with that, I am done, and I will take any questions if you have them.
Any questions in the room?
Hi, thanks for that information. Your pilot testing, do you have a plan for that testing approach? Is it just Connectathon based or?
We're working on, we are developing, not just Connectathon based, since we've done a couple of those. We're developing an overview of what we're thinking in terms of an approach, or at least what we envision would be a good solid set of actions in a more formalized pilot. I think we want to get it really tight in the next few weeks or so, and hopefully we can start sharing that. We are talking with at least one group already, sort of informally, about a potential pilot. But yes, we are working out sort of a formalized step-by-step method, maybe something that would take a period over a number of months. So we'll be able to share that hopefully in the near future.
If you're online, please leave a question in the Whova app. Any more questions in the room? Okay, thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you.